Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm here at the Miserable Liberal and Ron Placone.
Hi, Jimmy.
Hello.
Ron is in Florida next week. Go see him, ronplacone.com if you're in Florida. Big news happening today. This guy, you don't know who he is. I didn't know who he was. His name is William M. Arkin. He's a big shot writer, reporter, journalist for NBC News for a long time. And he quit. And there it is. He sent a letter out to all of his colleagues, and that letter got leaked to CNN. And he really goes after not only NBC and MSNBC News, but he goes after the news in general. And here's Glenn Greenwald tweeted out the story. Longtime reporter leaves NBC and MSNBC email statement saying these outlets are captive to the national security state and devoted to endless war. Quote, defenders of the government against Trump, cheerleader for open and subtle threat mongering, reflexively pro-war. This is what this guy, I'm going to read you to his letter to you, but here's Glenn telling you about it. Here's The Intercept, a veteran national security journalist with NBC News and MSNBC, William Arkin, blasted the networks in a Monday email for becoming the prime propaganda instrument of the war machine's promotion of militarism and imperialism. So here it is. I'll read you what I consider to be the important part of his letter. He says, my expertise, though seeming to be all the more central to the challenges and dangers that we face, also seems to be less valued at the moment. And I find myself completely out of sync with the network, being neither a day-to-day reporter nor interested in the Trump circus. So he's saying, to me, the larger problem, though they produce nothing that resembles actual safety and security, the national security leaders and generals are allowed to do their thing unmolested. So he's saying the news does not push back against these generals and these warmongers, doesn't criticize them. I like how he puts it. They produce nothing that resembles actual safety and security, but they get to call themselves the national security leaders. He goes on, there is not a soul in Washington who can say that they have, quote, won or stopped any conflict. And though there might be the beloved perfumed princes in the form of the Petraeuses and the Wes Clarkses, or the so-called warrior monks like Mattis and McMasterses, we've had more than a generation of national security leaders who sadly and fraudulently have done little of consequence. So he's saying the news media just goes along. They just go along giving them a platform. They're not critical of this security state. They're not critical of the war machine. And he points it out. There's not a soul in Washington who can say that we've won or stopped any conflict in the last couple of... Look at this. And yet, we and others embrace these guys, these failed warmongers who've stopped and won nothing. Even the highly partisan formers who masquerade as analysts, we do so ignoring the empirical truth of what they have wrought. So let me read that to you again. So these people, of course, we always have the Petraeuses and the Wes Clarkses, the so-called warrior monks like Mattis and McMaster. We've had more than a generation of national security leaders who sadly and fraudulently have done little of consequence. So this whole last generation, they've done nothing. And yet, the news media embraces them. Even the highly partisan formers who masquerade as analysts. So he's saying both sides of the aisle embrace the war machine spokespeople. We do so ignoring the empirical truth of what they have wrought. And what is the empirical truth of what they have won? That there is not one country in the Middle East that is safer today than it was 18 years ago. Indeed, the world becomes even more polarized and dangerous. So this guy's really coming hard at the war machine and the failure of the news to report accurately the war machine. Windrum again convinced me to return to NBC to join the new investigative unit in the early days of the 2016 presidential campaign. I thought that the mission was to break through the machine of perpetual war acceptance and conventional wisdom to challenge Hillary Clinton's hawkishness. So when he rejoined NBC's investigative team on the 2016 presidential campaign, he thought that their mission was to break through the machine of perpetual war acceptance. So he's saying how the journalists in America ubiquitously have just accepted perpetual war, and that he thought it was his job to break through it. How? By challenging Hillary Clinton's hawkishness. That's what he thought. It was also interesting. It was also an interesting moment at NBC because everyone was looking over their shoulder at Vice. That's that new news organization on HBO. And was looking over their shoulder at Vice and other upstarts creeping up on the mainstream. So the new mainstream news was feeling the heat from young independent upstarts. But then Trump got elected. And investigations, which should have been about malfeasance and war and other things, those investigations got sucked into the tweeting vortex, increasingly lost in a directionless adrenaline rush. So instead of reporting important stuff, you're reporting on Trump's tweets. Why? Because it gives you an adrenaline rush. We got lost in a directionless adrenaline loss because they're just caught up. You're reporting the trees and you're losing the forest. You're reporting Trump's tweets and you're missing the bigger picture of everything. This is what he's saying. The national security and political version of leading the broadcast with every snowstorm. So when you lead it with Trump's tweets and all that stuff, that is the national security and political equivalent of leading the broadcast with snowstorm. Oh my God, we got to start. Okay. That's really well put, by the way. He said, and I would assert that in many ways, now here's the mind blower, that NBC just began emulating the national security state itself. Busy and profitable. Just like the national security state, NBC News was busy and profitable. No wars won, but the ball is kept in play. War sells papers, baby. I'd argue that under Trump, and here's where he, again, same thing that we've been saying here. I would argue that under Trump, the national security establishment not only hasn't missed a beat, but indeed has gained dangerous strength. He means that the national security establishment that we should be opposing has gained strength under Trump because the left is getting in bed with them. Now it's ever more autonomous, meaning the security state is now ever more autonomous and practically impervious to criticism. You saw what happened when Trump criticized the CIA? They were like, oh my God, he's going against his own intelligence community. I wish presidents would do that more often. I'd also argue ever so gingerly, I don't know why he puts that there, but he says, I'd also like to argue ever so gingerly that NBC has become somewhat lost in its own verve. Proxies of boring moderation and conventional wisdom. Defender of the government against Trump. Look at what he says NBC News has become. Proxies of boring moderation and conventional wisdom. Defenders of the government against Trump. Cheerleader for open and subtle threat mongering and in love with procedure and protocol over all else, including results. So that's like when they go, oh, can you believe Trump announced he's withdrawing from Syria in a tweet? That's not the right procedure. What a jerk he is. Instead of going, wow, we're getting out of a war. That's what he says when they're in love with procedure and protocol over all else, including results. That's what I think he means there, right? Mm-hmm. I accept that there's a lot to report here, but I'm more worried about how much we are missing. He's talking about the news media, and that's what we talk about here. When you talk about this invented Russiagate, like Rachel Maddow on MSNBC does, almost 24/7, you're not covering anything else. Well, they're obviously not covering anything else. They're not covering the good things about Bernie Sanders. They're not covering the Yemen war. They're not covering the 80% of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck, I'll tell you that. Hence, my desire to take a step back and think why so little changes with regard to America's wars. In our day-to-day whirlwind and hostage status as prisoners of Donald Trump, so he calls the news media prisoners of Donald Trump. He says, I think, like everyone else does, that we miss so much. Look, he's saying it twice. He's emphasizing how much they're not covering what really needs to be covered. People who don't understand the medium or the pressures loudly opine that it's corporate control, or even worse, that it's partisan. Sometimes I quip in response to friends on the outside and to government sources that if they mean by the word partisan that it is New Yorkers and Washingtonians against the rest of the country, then they are right. So what he's saying is we have one-party rule in Washington and New York. So if he means partisan, it's like the one-party rule against the rest of the country. They're right. I'm getting it right here, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Just want to make sure. He says, for me, I realized how out of step I was when I looked at Trump's various bumbling intuitions. His desire to improve relations with Russia, to denuclearize North Korea, to get out of the Middle East, to question why we are fighting in Africa, even in his attacks on the intelligence community and the FBI. Now, remember, this guy I'm reading right here, I'm quoting, is a famous reporter, war reporter for NBC News. And this is the stuff he's saying. He realized he was out of step when I looked at Trump's various bumbling intuitions, his desire to improve relations with Russia, denuclearize North Korea, get out of the Middle East, to question why we are fighting in Africa, and even his attacks on the intelligence community and the FBI. Of course, he is an arrogant and incompetent imposter, and yet I'm alarmed at how quick NBC is to mechanically argue the contrary. So he's saying all those things Trump wants to do are good. His bumbling intuitions, he's saying that even a knucklehead like Trump, who's obviously ignorant and an incompetent imposter, his bumbling intuitions are right. And he said he's alarmed at how quick NBC News mechanically just goes against whatever Trump does. Oh, Trump's for it, I'm against it. Trump wants to bomb Syria, I'm against it. Trump doesn't want to bomb Syria, I'm for bombing Syria. Trump wants to pull out of Syria, I'm for staying in Syria. So whatever Trump wants to do, they're just reflexively against it. And then he goes on to say, he says NBC they mechanically argued the contrary against Trump to be in favor. NBC is in favor of policies that just spell more conflict and more war. What have we told you at this show? That the news media, establishment news media, is always going to be for more war. Here's a guy on the inside saying it. He goes, really? We shouldn't get out of Syria? We shouldn't go for the bold move of denuclearizing the Korean principle, even on Russia, he says. Though we should be concerned about the brittleness of our democracy, that it is so vulnerable to manipulation, do we really yearn for the Cold War? And don't even get me started with the FBI, he says. What, we now lionize this historically destructive institution? So that's the important parts of that guy's letter. I think are the important parts. Also happen to be the important parts the Intercept extracted. I read the guy's letter. He goes on to says nice things about the people he worked with and how he's proud of the work they did and stuff like that. But this is the important part, I think, for our purposes. And here I like how this is Glenn Greenwald's commentary on this guy's letter. He goes, so that an entire generation of Democrats paying attention to politics for the first time because of Trump, they are being instilled with formerly right-wing Cold Warrior values of jingoism, uber-patriotism, reverence for the security state agencies, and for prosecutors, and a reckless use of the word traitor accusation to smear one's enemies, and a belief that neoconservatives embody moral rectitude and foreign policy expertise has long been obvious and deeply disturbing. That's a packed paragraph. He's talking about all the horrible things that are being inflicted on a generation of people who are turning into MSNBC and NBC News to get their news about what's happening because they're interested now because of Trump. And he says now those people, an entire generation of people, are being instilled with formerly right-wing Cold War warrior values. And what are those? They're being MSNBC is instilling them with jingoism, uber patriotism, reverence for the security state agencies, and prosecutors like Bob Mueller, who led us into 9/11. He led us into Iraq after 9/11. And a reckless use of the word traitor, the traitor accusation to smear one's enemies, and a belief that neoconservatives like Bill Kristol, and all those other of all those people embody moral rectitude and foreign policy expertise. Greenwald says these toxins will endure far beyond Trump, particularly given the now full-scale unity between the Democratic establishment and neocons. So this is the Democratic establishment, like Hillary Clinton and all those people who got in bed with the neocons because they opposed Trump. Guys like Max Boot and Bill Kristol. That's what he's talking about. And he ends with this. He goes, still, that a network insider has blown the whistle on how all this works and how MSNBC and NBC have become ground zero for these political pathologies of militarism and servitude to security state agencies, while not surprising, is nonetheless momentous, given how detailed and emphatic he is in his condemnations. So everything you ever thought about MSNBC and NBC News is true. Everything we've told you here is true. And what is this? And you know what really jumps out at me when I read this by this guy? And what Glenn says about NBC News and MSNBC, that they've become ground zero for these political pathologies of militarism and servitude to the security state agencies. Think about that. So what I want you to do is just think about that means, and you didn't hear about this from Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes isn't writing an article telling you how fucked up the news is. Rachel Maddow isn't writing an article telling you how messed up the news is. No, some nameless, faceless guy you never heard of at NBC decides to quit because he can't be a part of it anymore. He can't be a part of it anymore. He can't do this. I thought I was trying to make a difference. I'm trying to expose our militarism and our love and our thirst for war and how the military-industrial complex has overtaken our society, and it's not happening. The news media they're part of it. This is, I guess a lot of people, they read Chomsky, they read Manufacturing Consent, and they go, well, I'm going to do it different. Then they come to this, they're like, I guess I can't. You're not going to, the media is the extension of the elite. The media is there to represent the oligarchs' positions and their point of views. Not ours, not yours. That's why this show is popular and will never be on MSNBC. Because we reflect back your values and your point of view, not the oligarchs. We don't have owners. I don't have an owner. Chris Hayes, Rachel Maddow, they have owners who fire them if they get out of line. And that's why they stay in line. And that's why they tell you to stay in line and vote for the Democrats. They would never tell you to vote for a third. In fact, they blame people with no money and no power for all our problems. They blame Jill Stein. They blame an actress. They blame people like us, people who can't vote for the military-industrial complex anymore. So, did you guys get a chance to read that today? And any response? I mean, to me, it's just it's exactly what we've said here. Go ahead.
Well, the headline everywhere, because yes, I read it as well. The headline everywhere should be: guy who wants to do actual journalism finds out news agency isn't an appropriate employer, because that's what's going on.
And when you read something like this and you see that it's from a journalist and that he's actually highlighting what's wrong with the network that he worked for, you know how hard that is.
Right? He's burning bridges.
Yes.
Is what this is called.
In an entire industry of manufacturing news networks.
He's telling everybody in every agency, the corporate news agency, you guys are horrible. And I can't believe that we're a part of this. Chomsky was right. We're doing the bidding of these warmongers. That's what he's saying. And of course he's 100% right.
And I just want to point out, in the midst of all this, we still need to remember Julian Assange.
In the midst of all this, right? It's funny he doesn't mention Julian Assange. Isn't it funny he didn't mention Julian Assange? And now they're actually they sit in there and cheer on the prosecution of a journalist for doing journalism. He doesn't even mention that. That's the thing he did leave out. Good catch, Steph. I love what he says here, though. What Glenn says about how a reckless use of the traitor accusation to smear one's enemies. He's talking about his own. He's talking about Jim Risen in The Intercept. So he's calling out his own guy in his own publication, because we showed you that video. They had a 20-minute discussion about Jim Risen incorrectly using the term traitor. So kudos to look at Glenn. I mean, he's got balls. He calls out his own publication in his publication.
Well, the entire generation comment really sticks with me too, big time. And because, for me personally, I really came to get into politics when Bush was in office, because I didn't know why the hell we were in Iraq.
Right.
And I thought, why are we in Iraq? And so I started looking into stuff, and I read Noam Chomsky, and I saw the documentary Outfoxed, and then I learned what single-payer healthcare was, and then the lid was off. And I look at the generation now that maybe their political awakening was Donald Trump. Now they're hearing all this stuff of, well, you got to listen to the intelligence agencies,
Yes.
be a patriot.
Right.
And I heard that stuff too, but it was coming from the right.
Right wing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, now it comes from both. The Democrats are embracing FBI and Mueller.
I mean, come on.
So if this is your awakening, you're getting a very weird message.
Yes.
I mean, I remember watching Keith Olbermann and his outrage about going into Iraq.
Right.
I remember that.
Remember
and
that?
I remember him covering the story of his father's illness and examining our healthcare system.
Yep, I remember that.
And I remember tuning in and watching Rachel Maddow and just being so impressed by her breakdown of stories.
Yes.
And then suddenly there was this turn, and it's... it's the full, when it says an entire generation, we're talking about an indoctrination.
Yes, an indoctrination is right. And so now they're being indoctrinated into to think that the CIA, the FBI, that they're your friends, that we have to listen, that our military leaders and our generals, people who are, Mathis is a maniac. Mathis is a real killer. These guys are real killers. These guys, they think up all night. They're like, how can we kill some more? How can we, these guys, and you need those guys. You can't have Phil Donahue running your war.
And additionally,
you got to have maniacs who like to kill people running wars.
And I would say, like with Ron and your generation, I would say you ask anybody right now, and they would say, we all know there were never weapons of mass destruction. Right? That's what we hear.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, so they know.
So they know that.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
They know they lie us in the war all the time, except right when they're doing it. Except right at this moment, they're probably not lying. For some reason, that's what they think. I know. All right, so that's quite a. It's making about this letter is making a lot of noise today, and again, he has a pinned tweet. I'll be available for your podcast later.
Mm-hmm.
Read a book, he says. I guess whatever that means.
I don't need somebody to tell me to read a book. Do you need?
Like, no,
come on.
he's that's how he handles his popularity. I'm popular for a minute.
Go read a book.
Go read a book. Okay, but that was great. I appreciate that guy doing that, and I wish more people would do that. I wish more people on the inside would come out.
I hope it gets passed around the break room at MSNBC.
It's not.
It's posted.
What is that like over there, right? When after someone writes this article, what's it like at work the next? I mean, I talked about this before about the diminishment. Someone wrote an whole article about the diminishment of Chris Hayes, and it just to watch it happen. This guy who used to, the fact that he has to brag about that he got to talk about Yemen for 2 minutes. Like, dude, just leave. Just go do good journalism and stop towing the line. But they're not. That's not what it's about. He's got a nice place in Manhattan, probably several. and he's got his kids in a school.
I also had high hopes for Steve Kornacki with his rolled up
I
sleeves.
mean, he rolled up his sleeves. He looks
I
like
thought
he's-
I'm gonna get some real information.
But they all got kids in they got kids in private school in Manhattan that cost more than my dad made in a lifetime just to go there for a year, I'm sure. Anyway, so that's why we're here. So I appreciate them sucking, so it opens up a big lane for us. So what this guy's saying is now you know why you get your news from YouTube. If you like our content, looking for ways to help support, here's a great mug or a t-shirt or a thing. You can get it right underneath there, or you can become a patron to our show. We give you hours of bonus material every week. Plus, come see a live Jimmy Dore show. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all our live shows. And make sure you're subscribed. I know it sounds crazy, but they unsubscribe people from our show all the time, and you have to click that bell so they send you a notice when we drop a video. Thanks for your support.